Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 3 of our 3-part series on the role of Spiritism in the Mexican Revolution. With me from Mexico City is C.M. Mayo, who is the author of Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, Francisco I. Madero, and his secret book, Spiritist Manual. She is also author of a historical novel called The Last Prince of the Mexican Empire. In addition, she has edited an anthology called Mexico, a traveler's literary companion. And she has written some travel books, including Sky Over El Nido and Miraculous Air. Welcome again, C.M.
Thank you. Delighted.
Pleasure to be with you. We've covered a lot of ground now in the first 2 episodes of this 3-part interview series about how Francisco Madero, who is regarded by many people rightfully as the father, the founder of the Mexican Revolution, especially in 1910, and became president of Mexico, actually wrote a Spiritist Manual that you translated into English. And we've talked about the intellectual, cultural background of Spiritism and the manual itself. We've talked a bit about Madero's personal journey. He was a spiritual medium. He did automatic writing and felt himself to be guided to launch a revolution. And now the revolution has succeeded and he becomes president of Mexico at the young age of 38. It's quite remarkable. Nobody would have imagined such a thing.
It happened very quickly. It almost like magic in many ways. There were certainly many reasons for the Mexican Revolution, and there's a very large and excellent literature on the genesis of the Mexican Revolution, which was a struggle that continued after Francisco Madero for many years.
Yes, or at least a decade, if not more.
Yeah, so I don't want to... I give those books and those narratives their place. This focus is on Francisco Madero as Spiritist medium and as president. So he led the revolution of 1910. He pronounced it. He led the troops, and then after the revolution succeeded, what that meant was that there was an interim president. The other president, dictator Porfirio Diaz, ended up going in exile to Paris. He was already in his 80s at that point.
So at that point, Madero could have triumphantly marched into Mexico City and assumed the presidency, but instead he ran for election.
That's right. He ran a proper campaign all over the country, and they had elections, and as far as I know, they were clean, and he was clearly the winner. So he assumed
with a huge majority.
So he assumed the office of president.
Now let's just go back, though, a moment, because the revolution itself was precipitated by the fact that he ran earlier for the presidency and basically was cheated out of it.
This is a really clear point that has a lot to do with the Spiritist Manual, as I mentioned in our last segment. Madero's most famous book is called La Sucesión Presidencial en 1910, which means the presidential succession in 1910, in which he called, before 1910, he called for clean elections in 1910 with no re-election. So when that was not granted and he was jailed as a political prisoner, he escaped and pronounced the revolution, November 20th, 1910. And the revolution triumphed coming into 1911. It didn't triumph right away.
But there was an election in 1910.
Right. So then
it was a rigged election, I gather.
Exactly. And so then after the revolution triumphed, the revolution of 1910, Because when we talk about the Mexican Revolution, we're really talking about something that went on for many years.
Yes.
Past Madero. The struggle continued
Yeah.
after his death, but Madero started it in 1910. So then he ran for president again with a formal campaign and the whole thing, and he won, and he takes office in later in 1911.
And at this point, he is publicly disavowing his connection with Spiritism.
The Spiritist Manual, or Manual Espírita, came out when he was president-elect with another name, Bhima, Bhima, which is from the Bhagavad Gita, a character in the Bhagavad Gita, a warrior in the Bhagavad Gita. And there's a really interesting magazine that he sponsored called Helios, with an H, Helios. It's a Spiritist magazine where, on the one hand, they're celebrating the Spiritist Manual with an advertisement, and they're celebrating his election as president, but they're saying that he didn't write it.
Yeah. They had an editorial saying, of course, he didn't write it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We know that he did actually write it, and in the
That's
archive,
indisputed.
It's indisputed. I'm not the first to talk about this. Other leading historians have done so. And also we know from his correspondence in the archives, he says, please do not say that I'm the author. It would really damage my reputation as president. So he didn't want that to be known. It was kind of an open secret, and the political cartoonists of the day, they loved drawing pictures of him, raising tables and with weird spirits. So it was kind of an open rumor that he was a spiritist.
But it also gave people cause to treat him with contempt and with sarcasm.
Yes, and I think an important point is that that's also true today. That is also true today. That many people who are unaware of the roots and the origin of these ideas and the context, knowing nothing about them, dismiss them as supersticiones, crazy, nutty superstition. They don't want to know about it.
Well, there has been historically a lot of fraud associated with spiritual mediums, a lot of fraud. And some people are inclined to think it's all fraud, that it can't be anything but fraud.
Well, that's the comfortable assumption for them to make.
Yeah.
And that is, in fact, what many people do. And at that time, this is also, I think, true today to some extent. There are many people, including medical doctors, who equate hearing voices with schizophrenia. I mean, no discussion. You go to the lunatic asylum, and they're not willing to entertain any other possibility. And so those attitudes also prevailed at that time. So the fact that this was openly rumored was very, I think, did cause damage to him.
It was detrimental, and yet he maintained his presidency for, as I recall, 15 months.
It was short. There was a coup d'etat in February of 1913, and it ripped up central Mexico City, and he ended up murdered. One of the really interesting things about that coup d'etat is that one of the leading figures was General Bernardo Reyes, who had been a governor of an important state under Porfirio Diaz and was viewed by many people as a possible successor, strongman to Porfirio Diaz. And he had been jailed for trying to get up a rebellion. And in this coup d'etat, Bernardo Reyes was liberated, stormed the National Palace, and was the first person killed. He was not the only one involved in the coup d'etat, but he was killed. Where I'm going with all of this is that followers of Bernardo Reyes, who were called Reyistas, published part of the Spiritist Manual in order to say, look, he's a nut. He wrote this. So they used it to attack him.
Yes. If I recall correctly, Madero was very lenient with people who opposed him, including Bernardo Reyes.
Yes. I think, though, I talked a lot in our previous two segments about context, and I come back to that point. I think a lot of people have made the argument that, he was a spiritist, he lived this ideal world, therefore he was just flaky. It's
out of touch, unfit to rule.
But I think when we look at the context of the revolution, I think he understood very clearly that he could not govern without various groups allying with him.
Mm-hmm.
And if he went too far against any one of them, the whole group could turn against him.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the reasons he tended to be fairly light on some figures, thinking, like, we're not going to haul this guy out and execute him, because if we do, the whole army might turn against us. And that was the case in the Battle of Ciudad Juarez, for example. A lot of people couldn't understand why he was so lenient with the opposing general in that battle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason was he was trying to say, look, the minute we triumph, we're not going to throw everybody out, because they couldn't govern otherwise.
Now that opposing general you're referring to, if I remember rightly, was Huerta, the man who...
No, that was not. That was a different one.
Okay.
Huerta was the figure who ended up taking the presidency in the coup d'etat.
Yeah, and assassinating.
And it's
Madero.
it's a story for a novelist.
Mm-hmm.
It's these very strong personalities, and how he was actually helping Madero, and Madero trusted him.
Yeah.
And then Madero's brother Gustavo said, no, I think he's going to get up a coup d'etat against you, and Madero didn't believe it, and well, it turned out to be true. And one of the key things, coming back to the question of the influence of Spiritism, was that after Huerta made Madero prisoner, his first communication was to our U.S. ambassador, not rather a villain of Mexican history.
Wilson.
Yeah, he's one of the great arch villains of Mexican history. But in that communication, Huerta asked him, "What should I do with Madero? Should I send him to the lunatic asylum?" That was his first communication.
Yeah.
And Wilson answered, "I think you should do whatever you think best for Mexico." And we know the result of that.
He was assassinated.
He was assassinated.
With the support of the American ambassador, who, as I recall, was later recalled in disgrace
That's
by
correct.
President Wilson.
And this leads me to a very important point. A lot of people will jump to the conclusion that Madero was very naive. I think if we look at the record, the most naive person was General Huerta. He thought he could do this.
Get away with a coup.
He thought he could just have a coup.
Yeah.
He had no clue that you can't so easily govern by doing things that way, and the United States did not recognize him, and that was the end of his regime. He fell very quickly. So when we look at who's naive versus what's the image, I think there are many questions we have to ask before we jump to easy conclusions.
Well, let's talk about the role that Madero's Spiritist beliefs had in his actual governance.
Well, that, I'm not sure we really know the answer to that. We do know that he developed his skills, such as they were for mediumistic communication. We know that he took that very seriously. We know from his library, I had the privilege of being able to spend a lot of time in his library and really look at what he was reading, and in particular his copy of the Bhagavad Gita, which was covered with pencil marks. He was planning to write a book about the Gita for the general reader in Spanish. So we know that this was something personally very important to him, that he wrote the Spiritist Manual. Past that, we don't really have a lot of evidence to really know exactly what he was doing. One thing we know from his letters is that at some point he felt that he had graduated from writing to simply receiving telepathic communication. So when he was in office, we don't have any mediumistic notebooks from that period because he felt that he was simply getting the information mentally.
Well, we could look at his policies. We can see he, I think, was something of a moderate. The more extreme revolutionaries like Zapata, for example, felt he wasn't doing enough for land reform.
Right.
But he did institute land reform measures.
Yeah, I think we have to realize how difficult it was to govern in that circumstance, and that he did have a lot of former allies turn against him. They wanted things to happen faster. They wanted land reform now, and I don't think Madero was able to do it. I just don't think it wasn't a question of whether he wanted to or not. I just don't think he was able to do it. And I think there were also different revolutionaries. A a good example is Pascual Orozco in Chihuahua, who felt that, the revolution should have done more for them. Pascual Orozco is a very interesting case. He was a businessman and a muleteer who specialized in mule and wagon train transport in the mountains. So this was someone who, in a way, this is the words of Raymond Caballero, who recently wrote a biography of Pascual Orozco, which I really recommend. It's very good. He said this was a ready-made cavalry for the revolution. This was a guy who was used to commanding people, animals, transport. They had guns. They were fighting people in and out, so they knew how to show up and fight a revolution. Well, Pascual Orozco, who was from this little town in Chihuahua, thought that since he was the hero of the Battle of Ciudad Juarez, he should be the Minister of War, which is like being Secretary of State. I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, I think Madero realized if he put a person like that in a cabinet position, he would not be able to govern.
So he had, in other words, opposition both from the people from the old regime who remained in power, who he kept in power because he felt he needed them, and his revolutionary comrades who expected that he was going to pursue more ambitious goals.
And I think he was limited in what he was actually able to do. I mean, you cannot govern without the army. Yeah. And you've got to keep him happy or it isn't going to work. And you can pick a few people to throw out or throw in jail or whatever, but you can't necessarily do everything everybody wants right now. It just isn't possible.
Well, he did do at least one thing that was quite controversial as a spiritist.
Okay, you're talking about the Belén de Zárraga, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a very interesting case. Belén de Zárraga was, in her time, a very famous spiritist, feminist, which was shocking to sensibilities of the early 20th century, and theosophist. And she was Spanish, and she came to Mexico to give a series of lectures. And Madero and some members of his cabinet and family attended. This was considered an outrage. In fact, a large group of Mexico City ladies, nice people, actually came to Chapultepec Castle, which was the presidential residence, to protest that their womanhood had been offended by this.
Because he was associating with a feminist.
Yeah, and his answer was, well, it's a free country, it's free speech. She has a right to speak. Yeah. And that did not go over well.
Well, as I recall, stepping back now, in his early spiritist communications allegedly from his baby brother, his younger brother Raul, who had died, there was a lot of passionate argument about the state of the nation, how Mexico was about to fall over a precipice if he didn't intervene. And he I'm sure he believed he was saving the nation.
I think he did believe that. Yeah. Again, I wasn't in his head. So I think we have to, with many things like that, we have to stay in the gray zone. Or to use Jeff Kripal's term, we have to make the cut. Okay, that's what we hear. Yeah. What actually happened, we don't know, but that doesn't mean we're going to dismiss it.
Well, what we do know is that he received spirit messages to that effect.
Exactly.
And that he was a devout spiritist.
Yes.
We know that.
And I think to launch the revolution as he did, he really did risk not only his life, but his relationships with the head of his family. And I think he also knew that he was risking the material well-being of himself and his family, which was in fact the case.
He did risk those things.
It really, if you some people have tried to make the argument that he was a self-serving businessman in launching the revolution. I just don't think that holds up. No. On the contrary, I think the only thing that explains his taking this kind of action was that he truly believed that the material world was not everything and that he had to do the right thing and that the spirits were telling him to do this.
And I suppose we can look back now with the hindsight of more than a century, and we can say that since He launched that revolution in 1910. The Mexican presidency has always been limited to a single term.
Well, I think people can get into a lot of arguments about how successful was the revolution in those terms. But I think definitely no question Mexico's at a stage now where the elections are straightforward and they happen every 6 years. In the United States, we have one term of 4 years with one chance for re-election. So you have the most anyone can hold office is 8 years. In Mexico, it's 6 years. And this has been respected. So I think that in itself is an enormous achievement. And I think that it would be easy to imagine that without Madero, it might have had a very different development. We might have had someone like the General Bernardo Reyes or Huerta. Things might have looked very different than they in fact did evolve. So Madero definitely is a hero in Mexican history. He's not perhaps as prominent in the public imagination as Zapata and Villa and some of the other imagery that we have. As I discussed in the first section, I think Madero as a wealthy, beautifully educated person in a top hat doesn't quite fit with the imagery, the popular imagery of the revolution. But there's no question that he's a national hero. And you go to the Monument to the Revolution, you go to the National Palace, you see the murals. He's there. Every school child gets the story.
Well, what do the Mexican people most remember him for?
I think that he pronounced the revolution in 1910. I think that clearly is the key thing. The second story that most Mexicans are very familiar with, but that most of us in the United States and elsewhere are not, is the end of the regime. The 10 Tragic Days, it's called. That's a story all the Mexicans I know are very familiar with.
He was martyred, in effect.
He was martyred. The city was basically shot up, and there are a lot of very gruesome photographs from those days, a lot of bystanders. One of the things about Madero, coming back to the question of him personally and his Spiritist beliefs that I think is so essential to understanding him, is that when the coup d'etat happened, he heard about it by telephone. 1913, February 1913. He gets a phone call. So the telephones had just started then. He was in Chapultepec Castle, which is the presidential, was at that time, the presidential residence and the military college. And it's up on a hill a little bit away from the center of the old downtown. So he gets the news by phone, and he realizes he needs to go to the National Palace to take control and establish his authority and make sure that he's holding the seat of government. So he gets on this white horse. It's a gigantic white stallion. And he's from the north, so he knows how to ride a horse. He's just totally fine with that. He just hops on this gigantic horse, comes down the hill, and he had made a speech to the cadets at the military college that this is the march of loyalty. You are going to defend the Constitution. You're going to defend the Republic. And so with these military cadets just completely energized by this speech, they come down the hill and they come down this avenue, which is the Avenida Reforma, which is a very long and broad avenue, which was originally laid out by Maximilian in the middle of the 19th century after the Champs-Élysées in Paris. So it's this broad open thing. And he comes down this with all these guys marching. And then
riding a white horse.
And when he comes to the downtown, here's, I think, the really essential point. When he comes to the downtown, he had to go through this avenue, which is now called the Avenida Madero, in his honor.
Named after him.
In order to come to the main square where there's the cathedral and the National Palace. Going down that on the top of this enormous horse with bullets flying all around. What was in his head? He must have just, the courage, that was like going through a gauntlet. It's like going through a canyon where anybody, these are tall buildings, 2-3 stories high with balconies and windows on both sides, close in. So to sit with your head exposed to the top of this horse going down this avenue was incredible.
And he was assassinated later, not then.
So he got to the National Palace, and there was a battle in the National Palace, and that was when General Bernardo Reyes was killed, and
Huerta, the fellow who eventually deposed him, offered protection.
Yeah.
So let me protect you.
It's a very sad story. It's a very sad story. But Madero showed an amount of courage that is really at multiple points throughout his political career. But I think that in particular was something that, it's often skipped over when we read the story, to just kind of slow down and imagine what does it mean that he had the vision to do that. Now, it didn't work. He lost his place. He was killed.
But you obviously are quite inspired by his example.
I think it would be difficult not to be someone in that circumstance, to inspire these people, the cadets, to accompany him in this very showy, very courageous action.
He didn't fear death.
He didn't fear death, and I think that really is remarkable.
Well, and that is supposedly one of the hallmarks of spiritualism. You learn that death is an illusion. You don't need to fear it.
Well, that seems to be what he believed, and I think it enabled him to do what he did. Well,
C.M. Mayo, it's truly an inspirational story to know about. Very few people understand it, and you've done a superb job of sharing it with me for these 3.5 hours. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's really an honor and a delight. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Thank you.